Hello and welcome to the Agile Couple podcast. I'm Kevin McManus.
And I'm Leanne McManus.
And today we're going to be entering our second episode in our series called Modeling What Matters. During our last episode, we talked about the few who carry the many, and we had talked about the Price is Law. So today what we're going to be focusing on is leading loudly without saying a word, the power of behavior modeling. So Leanne, kick us off.
So you want to talk a little bit about what behavior modeling is?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah. So to me, the whole statement hinges on the word behavior. So a lot of people use a lot of words, but there's no behavior action that follows what they're saying, right? Or there's a misalignment there. So behavior modeling can be, and when I hear it, I think positive, right? So I have somebody who is hitting it out of the park, who does all the things that you want them to do, who kind of naturally is maybe influencing people, whatever that thing is, I want to figure out how we can model that behavior. But you can also have bad behavior that you get modeled as well.
Right.
Right. So one of the things that I think we want to talk about is you're modeling, every person is modeling behavior, whether you have an awareness of that or not.
Yeah.
Right. So it can be back to like your personal brand. So if you're somebody who's constantly showing up late, or for me, I don't mind multitasking as long as because some people can multitask but still be tuned in.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are like, I'm here, but I am not here. And that becomes very aware, and it's disrespectful for other people's time, right? So there's that follows, and that's modeling of behavior, or that's at least behavior that shows up. People may be influenced and start to model that. To me, that comes down to the leadership of whoever is in influence, managing the expectations of what's allowed and what's not allowed and what we want to model, right?
Well, I think you hit on a good point there, because that modeling, it can be both positive and negative, and it comes down to setting the expectations.
Yeah.
And whether you're a leader or whether you're somebody on the team, like you'd mentioned, that whole personal brand, if your expectation is the meeting starts at the top of the hour, but you're always 5 minutes late, people are going to catch on to that and say, if it's not important to you, why is it important to me? And then all of a sudden you see that propagation of a negative behavior that's taking form. So
you know what else that I've seen? Because this is what happens at the rumor mill or around the water cooler, right? Or the things that people talk about that they're annoyed with. So people already feel overwhelmed in too many meetings, and they're not productive, and all those things that we all know and feel. But I think I've seen, and I'm a talker naturally, so maybe I recognized this when I heard people complaining and went, oh, I think I do that. But so the meeting starts at the top of the hour, but you spend 15 minutes allowing baloney conversation. Other people who are busy and have things to do, feel disrespected by that.
Right.
So that behavior, they're not okay with, which then you might see them showing up late.
Yeah.
So you may have caused some negative behavior because of something that you were allowing or doing, right?
Yep. Very true.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about too, I think, when we were talking about in our last episode, we were talking about how there's inequity, right? So you were talking about Price is Law. What was your example with that? Do you remember?
Yeah, with the inequity, it basically is a matter if you have a subset of your overall team that's like very high performing and they're getting a lot of the work done, 50%, the square root of the team, that inequity shows up sometimes by those that are doing the work, that they view other people not carrying their weight, right? And I think that's something that you have to be aware of. And once again, we talked about it, when it comes down to Price is Law, it's simply a matter of having the awareness and being able to identify that. It's not a hard and fast type of rule, but it is something that will allow you to make adjustments, when necessary.
So in relation to this, my background long ago was in human resources, right? And so we've both been in leadership positions. We've owned companies. So lots of different degrees of being in that type of a role. But there is something that exists in culture, in any organization, doesn't matter. And it's basically very similar to what you're saying with the inequity. So the people who are doing the work are feeling like, well, wait a minute, they're getting paid, but they're not doing anything, that sort of thing. There's also internal inequity that can be learned or seen or felt. I would say from leadership not dealing with some negative behavior. And it's kind of similar because maybe in your example, something's not getting dealt with, or it's just the reality of who's doing most of the work.
Yeah.
But in this example, so if there are people who are demonstrating negative or behavior that we don't want, right? But it's not addressed and it continues to be allowed, there's internal inequity there too, and it starts to have another effect. And so you do have to recognize that, and you really should deal with it. So if you're saying this is how we have a team agreement, and this is how our meetings are going to run, and you're allowing people to not follow those rules and there's no effect, it's going to have a negative impact on the other people. And it causes disengagement, a bunch of other things, because they feel like, well, why do we have the rules? Why do you say you want this behavior? So you're saying the words,
Right.
but you don't have the actions to follow up. So that's an important thing, I think, to recognize.
Yeah, and I've experienced that as well. If you have somebody that's not pulling their weight on a team,
Yeah.
If you let that go as a leader, you're just, it's kind of like poisoning the well.
Yeah.
Because everybody that is around them knows that there's an issue.
Right.
And when you don't step up and, establish the accountability or take corrective action in order to, get them back in line or whatever it's going to be, then all of a sudden you have this negative effect across the whole team. Because once again, people are very perceptive. And especially when it's impacting them directly, they're even, more conscious of that.
Well, and if you allow for that type of thing, you might think in your head, because we all think we're doing the positive things, right? Maybe you avoid conflict and that's why you're not managing that or whatever. But you're like, no, I want to model this positive behavior. Unbeknownst to you, these other things are actually what are the neon sign going on. But for people to get engaged, and I think about newcomers to a team or newcomers to an organization, if you're allowing that, they're new, they're trying to figure out the ways. And if that's what it's the under the current type of stuff, you might be saying, here, we want everybody to do these actions and blah, blah, blah. Here's how we're supposed to show up. But this is actually the predominant behavior. That's what you're teaching.
Right.
That's actually what you're modeling.
Well, and you're inconsistent as well. Your actions aren't matching the
Yeah.
words. And that's the credibility and the integrity that you have to be aware of.
Yep. Okay, that was awesome. A little bit about modeling behavior is good, but Kevin, so there are kind of silent signals that you might see in a culture or on a team. What comes to mind for you that you could give guidance to someone for?
Yeah, so I've been the receiver of this and also been able to kind of set the environment where it kind of addresses this. But if you are being asked to be honest and to establish transparency, and you think you're in the trust tree, right? And then all of a sudden you provide your feedback and there's like this immediate shutdown of, I don't want to hear it, right? That's fairly explicit. Or you can also, what you're going to address is more of some of the implicit signals, which is you provide the feedback and then there's kind of a nonchalant, based on tone or what have you, that, I really don't, want to hear that feedback.
Well, that first part you said makes me think of people who are defensive.
Right.
So they say they want to, and in HR and even in leadership positions, you work with or for the executive team and they say they want to know these things, but really they don't want to hear it. And the worst part is when they want to come after whoever said it.
Right.
Well, wait a minute. You don't get to have it both ways.
Where's that coming from?
Right. What is your fear in that? But also, what are you modeling in that? Because you're teaching the culture to be quiet and that they don't have a voice.
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's true. The implicit thing I have, a couple things before I get to the implicit example I have in my life. The tone, and this is something that's funny because I think I brought up tone with you for 21 years, right?
Yes.
But it's the nonverbal communication. I mean, I guess that's verbal, but there's body language in tone, but also the way that you say a statement with the tone, passive aggressive,
or you don't say it,
or you don't. Yeah, your lack of saying something. That all has meaning, and it's all what people are putting together, whether they're consciously realizing it or not. Maybe they're uncomfortable being around a person in a meeting, and it might be feeding from all that stuff, right? So, and some people who just live honestly, like they don't play these games. Maybe they're new to the culture, and so they don't know the political games that are going on or whatever. They're reading people for what they're doing. They're like, wait a minute, I was just told my orientation that this is a loving culture, and we value feedback and blah, blah. And then really we don't, right? So it's a hard place to be. and you're gonna lose some good people
Yep.
in that,
Absolutely.
or turn some really quality people into behaviors that you don't want. So I do think when I was thinking through this, I was fortunate enough to work for a woman, and I was in a very large nonprofit organization, 25, I think, in kind of my first supervisory role. And it was a male dominated culture. Awesome culture, awesome mission, but definitely male dominated. And I worked for the CFO, who was a woman, the only executive that was a woman. And I wanted to be a professional woman because of her. And I think I've told her this over the years. Her name is Stacy. So she's watching this. Hey, Stacy. But there were things that she did and how she modeled the behavior, how she acted and showed up in that kind of difficult place to be. And this is back in the 2000s, early 2000s, right? I just had a lot of respect for her. And some people didn't like her because she was very direct and she had these standards that not everybody wants to be held accountable to. But what I appreciated about her was she had implicitly had accountability. So she didn't have to sit down and say, here's what I expect you to do. It was how she led and how she showed up. So I was always accountable. If I messed up, I was accountable to it. And what I always felt like was, even if I made a mistake, because we had that mutual relationship across our whole team, that she also had your back. It didn't matter if you'd made a mistake or not. We'll deal with that, but you own it, right? And you're representing us as a team and who we are and what we're doing. And I just learned a lot from her. So I think of positive behavior modeling, I think of her.
Yep. Yeah, and I think those are the things that kind of shape us to who we are today. And oftentimes, that knowledge bias creeps in a lot of different ways. It's like, we are who we are today based off of all of those experiences. We aren't who we are today just, magically out of nothing. But I think having those type of role models and having those type of mentors, because I'm in the same position, I've had some very good mentors, throughout my career. And I'm at the point now where, I have the ability to invest in some of those that are new to their career based on that experience, that I had gone through. So I think the role models that both you and I have experienced have been very positive, and we try to reflect that in how we work with, our teams and our clients and everything else.
Well, and I mean, we also have negative, right? So I do know that I have worked under owners, and I guess leaders, but they were more owners. They weren't really leaders. Where now I can think back, at the time I was just frustrated, but now I can look back and go, I did not align with their behavior and how they showed up and what they expected, because the words didn't match the actions. Right. And I'm kind of a transparency kind of driven person, and it was not in alignment with me. And it was kind of made me sick. It was a sick environment for me to work in and not a good fit for me. Other people may be fine in that role, but for me, I mean, thankfully I've got two very contrasting examples of that and maybe that was because it happened after that I knew this is not, I've already had it really good. So I recognized it earlier. Yeah. So what would you say are some of the things you might see show up for our audience in real world examples where maybe, and I guess we're kind of focusing on negative first, but what kind of things are behaviors that we might see that could perpetuate into other people modeling?
Yeah, well, I can use a personal example, because when I was leading a particular department, I had been having conversations with, my peers in the kind of the middle management as well as the executive team. And there were things that were very familiar to me because I had been having those discussions, but it didn't translate down to my team because I had to be very deliberate about communicating that. And the knowledge bias was, well, I'm assuming that if I know this, everybody else knows it. And you have to check yourself and be very deliberate about, okay, I can't assume that everybody can read my mind, because they can't. So then it's a matter of what do we put in place in order to ensure that that information is flowing, throughout the organization, and remove myself from that bottleneck. And once again, it wasn't intentional. It was simply with everything going on, there was that implicit knowledge bias.
Just responding to stuff, right? Because it's very busy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it is, you have to manage that stuff. That comes with, when we talked about in our first series, though, when we're talking about radical transparency, it's not a single thing. It's all these things you have to set up, and it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of planning, and it's a lot of awareness and introspection and allowing feedback for how is it going, and let's iterate on that. And it's simple to understand, but hard to put into practice.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of things that can be described that way. But the beauty of it is once you actually start seeing that momentum where there's change and you're actually establishing that transparency and the communication is flowing much more freely, it is an amazing environment to work in, when you have that. And I think you appreciate it even more when that's not in place and you're in an environment where it's very siloed and there's not a lot of transparency. Then you become very aware that, hey, this is not a situation.
I am not in alignment with this.
Right.
Yeah. And maybe that's the thing. So if you are in a healthy culture or you're part of a team where it's just natural and easy, and then you end up later in some other culture, you will recognize it. You will feel every bit of your being feels it. And good or bad, maybe it's just a maturity time of where that organization at or team is at, or if you need a change in leadership or whatever it is. But and as you get older too, because I'm a woman of a certain age now, like what I would put up with is nowhere near what I would put up with in my 20s. Yeah. So I'm thankful that I was in my 20s when I had that really positive example. Yeah, in that time. So I was thinking about some of the other things that show up, because you and I were talking about this, like, and I may have even mentioned it, like I feel like some people can multitask and still be like tuned in. Like, and I a lot of times am taking mental notes of stuff. It might look like I'm multitasking, but I'm actually, that's the way that I learn and I retain information. Listen to people type when they're in a meeting. They're probably multitasking and tuned you out, right? So there's some of that behavior that if I were leading a group, as a team, we need to be respectful of each other's time, and ultimately we're trying to be productive. So what are we going to allow, not allow, and then how are we going to manage that? So that's the cool thing about Scrum teams. If they're really living and breathing like what they've agreed to, we're starting on time and ending on time. So if you show up late, you're out of the discussion, right? There's behaviors that are uncomfortable. They could be seen as like conflict, but they're more just we're having accountability in what we all agreed to, right? So there has to be some uncomfortable like reactions to some of that stuff. You were talking about leaders, and one of the things that, besides the feedback and not respecting that, remember what you were talking about with it, and you've witnessed this with some leaders where maybe they don't want to take ownership of mistakes, or they don't. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think once again it goes back to the authenticity, right, and your integrity. And I think you have to exercise that intellectual humility and recognize that you're going to make mistakes. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with making mistakes. I mean, I tell my teams, if you're not making mistakes, you're not growing. You're not pushing yourself. You're in a comfort zone, and you're not going to be able to grow beyond that. You have to be able to challenge yourself and be willing to make mistakes, because in doing that, you actually experience that growth. However, if you have a leader that is, for whatever reason, incapable of being able to admit when they have a mistake, there's an implicit behavior that they are modeling there, which is if they don't have to take account for when they make a mistake, then why am I obligated to do the same?
Or it's just definitely building a silo.
Absolutely.
On that team or across those people. Yeah, and I think most people have been there where they work with somebody like that, whether it's a leader or not, and it's hard to be honest in who you are and like, yes, I'm fair with this, but I don't want to be the only one taking accountability, or I don't want to be the one that's always taking the blame, fair or not fair, or whatever, right? You kind of build that up.
Yep.
I want to talk about conflict too, because another note we have here is avoiding conflict. So you might see modeling passive leadership. I am somebody who loves to go head on into conflict. And that doesn't sound like I'm looking for a fight, but I just think it's healthy. And I personally would rather just be direct and deal with stuff. You can do it in a constructive way. So as a leader, I think that if you're uncomfortable with this is something you should go work on, because this is it's not going to go away. Your lack of dealing with it doesn't mean conflict isn't there. It's actually going to pop its head up in lots of ugly ways. So that's a note that I would give as a coach to somebody or mentor to somebody is, if you're uncomfortable with that, go find some way to exercise that muscle so that you become better at it. But conflict is healthy. Yeah. But you have to set up the guardrails. So if you're the leader, you need to say, maybe this is our agreement, or this is how I want to work. I'm not saying I want you guys to duke it out or scream at each other. That's not what we're saying. That's not what conflict is. Conflict is having a differing of viewpoints, of a misunderstanding, of maybe somebody did make a mistake and it caused some other problem. How are we going to deal with that? And the biggest part about that and the failure is, are we talking about it, learning, and then adapting? Because if you're not doing those things, that's what conflict brings. It brings you a resolution to deal with it. If you're repeating these things, you have a problem. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that reminds me of an example, when I worked for a company as an engineering manager, the CEO is one of those people that he would give people first chance, second chance, third chance, fourth chance.
That inequity, internal inequity would show up there, right? Like, why does Sammy get 16 chances?
Well, I think in this situation, though, it was a matter of that it wasn't an equity. It was really more of a cultural aspect that he was setting the example, which is it's that extending of grace. You're going to make a mistake.
He did it across the board, though. He didn't pick and choose people.
Right.
So there's a difference. Yeah.
But what that did is it also created an environment where he built trust with people.
Yeah.
Because when somebody did make a mistake and he came along and, basically did kind of the retro and said, okay, what went wrong? Why did it go wrong?
Yeah.
And then what are we going to do to correct this? There was an expectation that was set in that conversation that I don't want to let him down.
That's very much like my example
Kinda
with
like
Stacy.
what you're doing with Stacy,
Yeah.
exactly. And what that did is it created an extreme amount of loyalty to not only him as an individual, but really the mission of the company. And that whole culture was kind of permeated, by that, just by that behavior being set. And in situations where you have somebody that may not be as forgiving or may not have that same mentality, it becomes very evident when the overall culture has been, to be able to give people those second and third chances.
There's some nonverbal stuff that goes along with that, with the feeling and the sense in the room, and just it's been set that way.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah, that's a cool thing to strive for.
Yeah.
I also think, because we talk about what we're not dealing with, I guess, in our training type of world and facilitation, but we're working with newer software engineers, and I uncomfortably make them celebrate failure. And at the beginning, they don't know, it's very uncomfortable. They don't like it. And I'm like, wait, stand up. Tell everybody what you did, right? Yeah. They don't love it, but it's like a quick example of like teaching a culture that it's okay. Because we're kind of taught to not own it, to hide it, to whatever, cover it up or whatever the thing is. No, but the whole point is, are you learning from it?
Yeah.
Are you adapting? And if there's no learning to be had, then that's probably not great. But I think most times that there's like a failure in something, it's multifaceted. It's not one single thing that somebody did that caused a failure.
Yeah.
And there's learning to be had, and the retro is a great way to get that out.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think as you are involved in your career, in the beginning you may be your scope or your blast radius, as far as if you make a mistake, it's not going to be as critical.
Right.
But I think that's the time to be able to start recognizing that there are learning opportunities in those failures. So as you progress up in your career and you have greater amount of responsibility, it's not something that's foreign to you to be able to say, "Yep, I made this mistake." Instead, you've got a natural process, that you've been going through to be able to deal with that. And I think that creates that environment, where those mistakes are just it's going to happen. We're not we're not perfect. And we're going to make mistakes.
But also going back to the radical transparency, and if you can kind of live more like in an agile way on your teams, you have those feedback loops, you're finding it out quicker. So the mistake isn't massive. So that blast radius is contained.
Exactly.
Right. So it's a bunch of these things, which is why we're really doing this podcast, is to share all of these little tidbits of things to try and help teams and try and help leaders.
Absolutely.
Right. Hey, so I feel like we're kind of focusing on negative, but again, when I first said what I think behavior modeling is, I think first and foremost positive. So do you have an example of a positive behavior modeling, either about yourself or someone else that you've seen?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'll go back to the one organization and the CEO, because he was fantastic in the sense that it didn't matter if he was meeting with you for the first time as a new hire, or if he was meeting with an executive at a big financial firm. I mean, he was who he was. It was once again that genuineness, that
he was authentic.
He was very authentic.
Yeah.
And he also, he had the honesty and the integrity. And I learned so much from that particular experience that it carries over into, how I try to model that behavior, with the teams that I interact with, it was very positive. And I think if you have one of those positive leaders or those positive mentors in your life, it's kind of an exponential change,
Yeah.
because it carries on. Not
It
just
influenced
through,
you. It influenced that person. It
exactly,
influenced that person.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that the positive modeling, it can be so advantageous, to be able to have those people and to be able to have that level of scalability, that now you're kind of planting those seeds. You may never know, how you have influenced somebody, but just the fact that they've had that exposure, either to you or you have had that exposure to somebody else in that positive light, it truly is amazing when you see how influential somebody can be without really having the intent behind it. It's just who they are.
Yeah. Well, I think we both have seen it, and I've definitely seen it with other people that we've worked with. How people a lot of times have had a positive effect on other people, and so they are modeling something from what they learned from you, or how you worked your way through a scenario or a failure or whatever that is. And I mean, even if it's, I've seen it. You've talked about it with how you just made minor changes to the way that your teams would show up for meetings and that sort of thing, right? So it's like, that seems like such a minor thing, but no, it was impactful. There were impactful things that you did that made a difference, that somebody said, I want to do that too.
Yeah.
I've had people where down the road, maybe I kind of mentored them or just took them under my wing or whatever. And then when you see them leading something or whatever, and you're like, oh, they just did that thing, or they just said that thing that I gave them guidance on. It's an awesome feeling.
Right.
Because they don't necessarily come back to you and say, hey, I give you credit, whatever. It's not even about credit, but it's a really cool feeling.
Yeah.
When you were explaining that, and this just popped in my head, so it's our podcast, I'm going to say whatever comes in my head. But I had that thought, when you hear about people who pass and they, get to go to heaven and they meet God, and like you get it, you see your life flash by your eyes or what all that. My feeling when you said that was how cool, because I've heard people say that have had near-death experiences that you feel how you made other people feel. And I'm like, wouldn't that be a cool, I hope there's more experiences of that where you've had positive impact on people and they wanted to model something you did or said or whatever towards them. It's a good goal to have, right?
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay. So modeling with intention is the next little bit, which I kind of shared about my boss, Stacy, which is where I was thinking about this, but you could take the mindset really and like have the awareness, set your mindset, be strategic about how you're going to do this. You're not going to make all these changes overnight, but like conflict would be an area. If that's an area that you're like, I am not good at that, be intentional about trying to get better with what that means. And what does conflict mean? It's not a bad word.
Right.
We've tied negative connotations to it.
Yeah.
So put healthy in front of it. Do whatever you need to do, but what are the guardrails for this? And how are we going to make sure we manage stuff? Everybody has a voice. How are you going to make sure everybody has a voice? How are you going to make sure that you're not ignoring those things that make you uncomfortable?
Right.
Whatever those things are, I think that's modeling with intention. When we think about modeling, because we work with a lot of like world-class facilitators and technologists and agile coaches, and there are certain ones where it is just an easy peasy, like, I would want to model after this person. I want everybody to learn how they do this. And they're usually the most genuine, authentic.
Right.
They love giving. They love sharing what they do and their tricks of the trade or whatever. Like that's when I think modeling behavior, that's kind of more what I'm talking about. You can't model someone's personality. You can't, and that's the authenticity part that I think people have to be careful with. So somebody who doesn't understand that, it is not the same thing if I'm trying to act like Kevin.
Right.
That's not what we're saying, right? So do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that you need to do as a leader is once again, project those behaviors that you want the team to, participate in. As an example, when you're in a software development manager position, that's different than being a developer.
Yes.
Now, even though I came from the developer ranks and everything, and I did the coding and everything else, I've got empathy for what they're doing. But in a leadership position, when you're leading a group, it's an entirely different, skill set. So, for example, when we've had production releases, right, I may not be able to contribute directly to the activities that are going on, but I make sure that I'm there and I'm present.
Yes.
Right. because I don't want them having to be there at 8 o'clock at night until 1 o'clock in the
Or
morning,
all weekend long they're working.
or all weekend long. I mean, there's many a nights that I've slept on the office floor, and what I'm doing is bringing coffee, bringing Mountain Dew, pizza, whatever to keep them going. But just having that presence there, that's where I've got a ton of feedback from people that are like, it's kind of, he's got my back. He may not be contributing to the task, but he's there.
He's not at home while we're here missing time with our families.
And I think that's really, really important. And to me, that was not something that just was, inherent. That was something that I saw others that I had the opportunity to learn from. And I knew how that made me feel. So now being in that position, it's like, it's just that return trip, right? It's sharing with other people and supporting them in a way that I was supported, during my career.
Yeah, I like that. So I would also say, like, as a leader, you might have some introspection and ask yourself questions. So based on how I show up, or over the last week, or whatever that timing is, you want to kind of look at it. It's like, if I could think back and be somebody else sitting in the room or in the meetings with me or whatever on projects, what would they take away as important to me? What am I modeling? And is it in alignment with what I think and what I've told them I want to model?
Yeah.
So it's not a simple thing to do, but I think it's important to go, oh. And I know you've done this before, that because miscommunication happens, right? And even some of that knowledge bias, I just know over time that, like, you get information from an executive team, now you're going to tell your team, and something gets lost in translation.
Right.
And there's some historical debt because it's a big, older company. So people are like ready to charge or whatever, that when you own that and you're like, oh, okay, nobody even brought this up, but I'm going to pull everybody together and go, I just realized that I said X and I forgot to tell you F. So another thought, and I love this, I'm just going to read this off our page, but it says, if you asked yourself, if everyone behaved like I do in a meeting, what kind of culture could that create? Or would that create, right? So picture yourself like those things that you think you want to emulate from yourself or others, and you start to build that, and you have all these people, and kind of like you were talking about, working for that awesome leader, and now that's actually planted seeds, and it's beyond that organization. It's wherever these people go, because you haven't worked there for 20 years,
Right.
and it's still ingrained in your head, and
Absolutely.
it's very meaningful to you. Can we switch gears one last little bit here, talking about how do you model when you're not necessarily a leader? So how do you influence and model? What does that look like for those that are not a manager or a leader?
Yeah, I think, leadership is something that is not engendered by your title, right? I think leadership is simply a way of expressing to others, an example by which you can live by, So if you think about, with you and I being in a small business, we've talked about how our faith, is running your own business and being an entrepreneur can be a faith walk, right? And it's like one of my favorite verses is 1 Corinthians 11:1. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ, right? And I think it doesn't matter, for example, if you have, some people get hung up on name dropping, and they're like, this person, is of this stature, or the CEO. At the end of the day, we're all humans.
Yeah,
right?
we all put on pants.
We're all
leg prisons, whatever you want to call them.
We're all just people. And I think, one of the most important things that I try to exhibit, and one of the most important things that I see in people, is it doesn't matter who you're around, there is that consistency.
Yes.
So you could be talking to the CEO, or you could be talking to the maintenance guy, and there's consistency in that behavior. To me, that's showing those leadership qualities, because you're not changing who you are based on who you're around, right?
Shouldn't change with the audience.
Yeah, exactly. And I think those are the things that, from a modeling perspective, from a behavior standpoint, those are the things that I admire. So, for, people who are struggling, but they've got that tenacity and they have that persistence, that's showing a leadership quality, because you need to have tenacity. You need to have that persistence in everything that we do. And regardless of the circumstances, if you're able to exhibit that, that's, a behavior worthy of modeling.
Well, and I think if you're a really good leader that envisions this, and you've got the right team, and you start to set the guardrails, and you provide the environment, most of that modeling actually comes peer to peer, really. So you're allowing for it, and it can be far beyond what one person in a leadership role can do because you've allowed people, you've set the culture, right?
It is a culture.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, it's kind of unstoppable when you're able to do that. And if you've been thankful enough to work on some teams that have that work, when I say it's natural, it's because of that.
Yeah.
Right? You have the ability of the autonomy to do it. There's accountability. There's respect for one another. There's ownership in what you do and don't do. And just, it's all happens. And I guess when we hear high performing teams, that's probably a lot to do with how you get that because we're modeling behavior and have aligned goals and, all of that stuff. So
Yeah.
that's good. So do you have any final wrap up or takeaways about behavior modeling or I don't know, accountability or steps that a leader or someone else might take?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I would give advice to is give yourself some grace. You're not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
Right. The actions that you take there, you're going to make mistakes. One, own them. Right. Because once again, I think that establishes for you internally, that level of accountability that before I hold somebody else accountable, I first have to hold myself accountable. And, I think that people oftentimes don't think that they are leaders.
Yeah.
Right. And this is where you need to kind of adopt that mindset that I'm not perfect, but every day I'm going to aspire to be better than I was yesterday. And I think that gives us all that motivation, one, to give ourselves grace, but also to always look for that higher standard that we need to be striving towards, and also setting good examples for those around us, whether it be in a professional setting, whether it be with our family, our community. All those things are impacted by the way that we behave.
Yeah. Well, and as we were talking about the title of this, it's more about doing it quietly. So using words really is meaningless. It's about the actions.
It is.
So that's when we say behavior, that's really what we're talking about. It's not the words. The words might give you the vision and kind of give you the destination of where you're going, but how you're getting there is all based on that.
Yeah.
Your behavior,
Yeah,
right?
Totally agree.
Well, it's awesome. So this is our second episode in this series. We've got one more episode. It's called The 20% That Changes Everything, Modeling Focus for Maximum Impact. So just a little bit more about this because we want to help you build the best teams you have.
Absolutely.
That you could possibly have anyways, right? Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
All right.